Compliance is a profession where people work tirelessly to make the world a better place. And there are hundreds of amazing and inspiring women who have helped the field develop into what it is today. Great Women in Compliance is part of the Compliance Podcast Network, so join Mary, Shirley, and Lisa Fine as they talk with women in compliance who are making a difference.
Welcome to the Great Women in Compliance podcast with Lisa Fine and Mary Shirley. I'm Mary Shirley, and you can find us on the Compliance Podcast Network. We're across all sorts of podcast players, every single one, and you can even find us on YouTube. We are very pleased to welcome Asha Palmer to today's show. Asha is very high profile in the world of ethics and compliance in more recent times as a consultant, but she's also worked in-house at United States and Emirati companies previously, which actually has some parallel and alignment with a little bit of my life there. So I'm going to prod you on some of your experience out in the Middle East. So welcome, Asha. Please tell us about your working history.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you for having me. And I'm not sure I've been labeled high profile before, so I'll take that. Just a little bit about my working history. I am a lawyer by background. I went to NYU Law School and then did the traditional path of going into the law firm, doing litigation, doing some internal policy work there as well for companies to look into their internal investigation process, et cetera. I then went to the Department of Justice just for a few months to see what it was like to be part of the regulated bodies that really make sure companies within the U.S. are doing the right thing. And so I worked on SCA cases during my time at the DOJ and really saw from a government perspective how they looked at ethics and compliance programs. I then moved to the Middle East, where I was able to teach a class on business ethics, which I know we'll talk about here, but also work for an Emirati company, Mubadala, which is a sovereign wealth fund. And there I was able to establish, enhance, and optimize ethics and compliance programs across the world. Mubadala's portfolio extends from as far west as Canada and as far east as Indonesia. And so many of the portfolio companies at Mubadala have varying levels of maturity in their ethics and compliance program. And so we were really able to partner with them to be able to develop their programs, which led, when I moved back to the US, naturally into the consulting business that I started, Global Compliance Consulting. And there I am able to do very similar things: establish, enhance, optimize wherever my clients are. I always say I meet my clients where they are, which is so important because as we think about the maturity of the ethics and compliance function, it's important that we start where we are and continue to build on that. So that's where I am now. And in the future, I'm actually looking at joining in-house Conversant to really enhance technology in the space of ethics and compliance, where I believe it will make scalable and sustainable difference in our profession and in the world.
Wonderful, excellent. And so you touched on the business ethics teaching in Dubai. I'm curious to know, and I'm thinking back to when I was a student in New Zealand, we didn't have compliance courses, and I don't believe that's changed. And of course, the United States has seen an introduction in the last several years of compliance being offered as a subject within certain universities. How popular were compliance courses in the Middle East?
Yeah, Mary, popular is an interesting word. I think forced is probably the better word.
Okay.
So the business ethics course that I taught was actually part of the undergrad business curriculum. And so it was one of the foundational required courses for any person getting their business degree. So you know what it's like to have a required course, right? It's dreaded, it's anticipated, but you know what was very interesting was when I got the curriculum for the course as to what teachers had taught in the past, to sort of figure out what my curriculum would be, I understood why people didn't like it. It was very theory based. It was very hard to relate to. And, you know, we're talking 20, 21-year-olds. And so you can talk to them about theory and we can debate it, but they wanted to feel it, to touch it, to make it practical. And so I really had to redo the entire course, and I influxed it with companies that they cared about. So we talked about Starbucks, we talked about Uber, we talked about Louis Vuitton, we talked about Porsche, we talked about ethics cases in the lens of things that mattered to the population I was teaching. And I really reflect on that so many times, even today, because what I was able to do was see that people weren't understanding it or getting it and weren't relating to it. So then they weren't applying it. And to me, that was the biggest miss, because we need business majors, the leaders of corporations, the leaders of countries, the leaders to really understand it if they're going to apply it. And I apply that to all my training and engagement throughout the rest of my career, where we really need to make it so people can touch it and feel it so that they apply it.
Perfect. And what we should be doing as compliance officers all of the time, and really interesting seeing it through the perspective of someone who's teaching the potential compliance officers of the future and how to pique their interest, and something that I think a lot of us who do it now are supernaturally excited in. But as you say, there is something about almost the dread of something that's forced upon you rather than making the decision yourself to join the class. So I love that. And I have no doubt that your ability to make it more engaging really made a difference to the satisfaction of the learners. And then, sorry.
You know, I see us as teachers. I see compliance professionals as teachers. And what you want to get out of teaching is for someone to have learned something they can apply in their life.
Absolutely. And I think there's a lot of teaching going on, beyond the education that we do in our compliance roles. There are so many, again, high profile, influential people like yourself who are really role models and mentors for others in the industry, the staff members around them. And so I think it's great to consider ourselves as always being a teacher in some kind of a way, and how we can best relate to the varied audiences that we have in front of us, whether it is the business, whether you are an adjunct professor, or whether it's the mentee that you've been paired up with.
That's right. And adapt. Yep.
Mm-hmm. And then one that I have a special interest in, I wanted to ask you about. So for me, back in, actually it's almost exactly a year that I quite hastily packed my bags on a whim. I packed up my apartment in New Zealand and moved to Singapore. And I'd never been to Singapore before. I didn't know what language was spoken. I didn't know the ethnicity of the people. I knew nothing. And my plan was to go, and actually similar when I moved to Dubai a few years later. I went off and I had in mind, okay, this will be fantastic. I'll do a little 2-year stint. Anyway, it's 10 years later. I've not returned to New Zealand, and I've since been to Dubai, back to Asia, ping-ponged around Asia. Found myself in the United States, possibly against all odds, really. It's really freaking hard to get a job here as a foreigner. And so, I always ask myself whenever I go home to New Zealand, am I ready? Is it time yet? And as lovely as the time is that I spend with my family, catching up with friends, eating the foods that you can't get anywhere else, I always, well, until, to date, the feeling has always been, nope, I'm not ready yet. So
Right.
I'm curious, very personally, after spending 4 years overseas as an expat, you returned to the US in 2018. How did you know that it was time to return home?
I blame my husband. I probably wouldn't have moved home. No, we enjoyed our time in the Middle East so much more than we ever could have imagined. It offered us so much in life. The one thing that the rest of the world gets that we don't get very well here in the United States is the ability to unplug and to, go on vacation and to relax. So I really feel like our time in the Middle East gave us some years back on our life. It also took it away because in those 4 years I was there, I managed to have 3 children. So it took just as many away as it gave me.
Yes.
But no, I mean, I think, for us, we learned a lot about the global world and society that we live in. And we had gotten those lessons and that value. And we needed to begin to bring it back to the United States in a way that was impactful. And so we moved over to the Middle East to learn and to grow and to learn about different cultures and religions and customs and norms so that it could then feed into our lives. And with that, we had an obligation to bring it back to the US. And I am reminded every time when people say, how was it to live in the Middle East? And I'm not sure the intent of every person who asked that question, many of which you haven't traveled there, but it's an education opportunity to open people's mindsets, to open their hearts to the wonderful experience that we had. But to be honest with you, if it wasn't a 14-hour flight to get home with 3 kids under the age of 5, then I might still be there today. So,
well, yeah, that's a really interesting observation. Your thoughts on the unplugging. I would say that if I ever had a chance to speak to someone who had a great deal of power over the standard of living in the United States, my feedback would be this is the country where people take the least vacation time, where people are given the least holidays and by holidays, I mean the term vacation time, or what you guys call PTO, out of any country I've ever lived in by a country mile. And it scares me from the perspective of a foreigner because I worry about collectively as a nation the levels of burnout that have to be occurring in the United States, and how much more fortunate I feel when I've thought back to the times when I've been able to take more rest than is afforded here. And I feel relieved that, at least, one day I'll be able to have my vacation time back and everything. And I think that not everyone else will. And so if you're listening to this and you're feeling the same, it's totally fine to take a step back and to pause. And I have a friend, Danielle North, who is a coach in the United Kingdom, and she has a really nice way of talking about what she calls pausing, which is essentially in life, if you don't pause when you need to, your life will do it for you. And I very, very strongly believe that.
Yes.
So,
yes, I mean, that's such a powerful message during COVID-19 too, as well. Right.
Right.
And I think if we even put our professional spin on that, one of the things that the financial sector has learned, right, financial services sector has learned, is forcing people to take a break is actually a really good thing for compliance, because it makes someone step into their role. It makes people see whether things are awry or whether there's something, shaky going on within that person's domain. And so it actually is not only really good for the individual, but it's actually really good for the company.
Yeah, that's a great point. And for anyone who missed it, we have an episode that really touches on this point nicely in terms of how it is essentially a financial control to have someone step in while someone else who is in charge of purse strings and decision making of where money goes, or at least control, to be able to do their job for a while. So I hope that as time goes on, I don't mean to apply my own cultural expectations that I've experienced and say that they're better than what happens in the US. I just think that everyone is worthy of taking a break and having some downtime. And I just think that Team America works so hard. So hard.
Mary, that reminds me, every time when I talked about my career earlier and when I transitioned, so when I transitioned from the law firm to DOJ, the interesting thing, at the end of your service with the company, they cash out your PTO, right? Or they cash out your vacation. And it was always so funny. I will tell you this, I never cashed out any PTO. I always took my vacation. I think you need it, and we give our company so much. We need to take something for ourselves as well, as far as refresh, reframe, re-energize.
Yeah, totally agree. And then on that point, you mentioned that was something that you found as a real positive. Was that the most fulfilling part for you about being an expat, or was there something else that stands out?
The travel was great. The most fulfilling part for me, though, was getting to know people that I would have never gotten to know had I stayed in my comfort zone.
Yeah.
And just the realization that people are people, and we are all so much more similar than we are different. It's just something sometimes you have to see and experience to really understand. And so that was the most fulfilling part for me.
I can certainly echo that sentiment, I think, for me as well. All right, so moving to changing gears to a more technical compliance angle here. I know that as a specialist in risk assessments and compliance program assessments, you're very strong in this area. Will you please share with our audience the difference between the two and the most common mistakes companies make when executing these initiatives?
Yeah, I am very passionate about risk assessments and program assessments, as you said. Actually, just taught a course with Amy Sandu at University of Colorado on risk assessments and how that ties into program assessments. And so how I really see the difference of the two, they are definitely dependent on each other, but a risk assessment should be just one part of an ethics and compliance program. And so while your program first, and actually it's a foundational element, right? And so your program should first know what the company risks are, know what the geographic risks are, know what the people risks and the risk exposure is. And then you should really build your compliance program and its touch points based on the risks. And I think the best way I frame it is looking at DOJ guidelines. And what's interesting is a lot of my clients are not US-based companies. And so I do have to explain, why should we care about what the DOJ says is an effective compliance program? I mean, there's a few reasons we should care. One, because jurisdictional reach it is a bit ambiguous. And I always say, if the DOJ wants you, they can find you.
I agree. Yeah, I say it all the time. If they want to capture you, they will.
They will expand. They will find your toe in the sand somewhere and they will
Yeah.
find you. And so that jurisdictional connection and pull is expanding day by day. But two, it is the most detailed guidelines for a compliance program that have really ever been written, the most comprehensive. And so regardless of whether you are held accountable to them, if you're in front of the DOJ, it's just a good guide to say, what should my program have? What matters for my program, and where should I allocate my resources? One of those areas in your program is the risk assessment. And so distinguishing those two is very important. But your entire program, once you have your risk assessment, know what your risks are, know which ones are high, medium, low, however you choose to classify those, then you will need to solve the problem. So if you have a high risk, what are you going to do about it, right? And the thing that risk assessments for me are so crucial is because they help you assess your controls, right? And they help you assess your program as well, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if I have a high risk area and my only control is my code of conduct test that I give every year, I could have an over reliance on that control.
Right.
And so maybe I need to look at some of the other areas of my program and supplement those. So policies, trainings, engagements, communications, controls that are not people-based but process-based. And so it really gives you a chance to thoughtfully deploy the resources of your program in a way that makes sense.
Excellent. That's fantastic, and I can see why you are a teacher in this area. I'll have to see if I can get Amy's perspective on the show as well.
Yeah, and the important thing you asked, what is the most common mistakes companies make when either doing a risk assessment or a program assessment, and I think it's overthinking it, right? And it's really you have to start somewhere, right? You have to look at what's working and what's not in your program. You have to know your risks, because if you're just saying, I'm going to train every year on conflicts of interest, or I'm going to train every year on antitrust, and you don't have an antitrust risk, that doesn't necessarily make sense. And I think what we can get so much from the DOJ guidance on what our compliance program should look like, they want to make sure it's thoughtful, right? They want to make sure you thought about what you were doing and didn't just say, okay, I need a training on this, I need a training on this, check. And that is the evolution beyond it, just someone told me I need to do this, versus thinking about how to actually change behavior and build accountability within your program in a meaningful way.
Yeah. And just documenting it, right? Like, if you don't think that you have a specific risk, or that it's negligible to the point where you don't have to train on it on an annual basis, as long as you're showing the process that you went through to determine that risk assessment, and you're documenting why it is that you've decided not to act on it, no one's asking you to do everything under the sun. It just needs to be proportionate and risk-based.
Yep. And, I give the example when I sort of socialize these risk assessments to, different departments, is like, I use an analogy of my kids, right? And, they take something out of the cabinet they're not supposed to take. I want to know why they took it. Why did you think why did you think that was a good idea? Why did you not choose to do something differently? And so that's what the DOJ is going to do. They just want to know why you did what you did. It's not necessarily a critique that you didn't do it. The question is, why did you choose to do this and not something else? And as long as you are able to answer that question and show you have thoughtfully managed your risk, then the DOJ will give you some credit for that, for sure.
Yeah, I always figure if, you pluck any other reasonable compliance officer and they can say, yep, that seems like a logical step to have taken, or a decision to have made in that process, I feel a lot more comfortable about any decision that I make about, what to do or what to omit in the program.
For sure. I mean, no one in compliance ever said I have enough resources. So
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's the expectation, right? It's just how you use and deploy your resources, again, in a way that makes sense for you.
Yeah, I have too much money is never
No.
on the top of our list of complaints.
Never.
One of your focus areas is changing culture and conduct, which is a topic close to my heart as well. What are your change management tips for the compliance officer of today who, for the most part, has established themselves as a true business partner, not that naughty policeman who always says no, but you still need to confront shaping ethical behavior and tone in a company, which I always find a little harder to control because, I can be as awesome as I can in order to make people eventually go, oh, I wanted to hate you, but actually you're an all right person. But when it comes to shaping, the ethical behavior of an entity, and I guess the bigger the harder, what are your tips for that?
Yeah, it's so interesting because to me, culture and conduct, depending on where you are, can be the same thing or they can be very different. And so I think the first step is assessing whether your culture, the conduct of people within the organization is reflective of culture, and whether culture dictates conduct. And so I think understanding the interplay between those is the first step. And, I have been very successful with in-house and with my clients in doing different training, thinking about training and engagement differently and more progressively. Because really, when you get in front of the idea of we keep doing the same thing over and over, expecting different results, the actual definition of insanity,
officially,
then you change the way you look at things. And so, if you are training, or if you are engaging, or if you are talking to your management and it's not getting through, and it's not changing people's conduct, and it's not enhancing the culture, then what can you do differently? And that's why I think it's so important for compliance officers to connect with each other. I am a 100% advocate, even with my clients who are compliance officers. I connect them with other compliance officers because there's no reason that we should be reinventing the wheel as to what works. If we are doing the same thing over and over again, we're not getting different results. We can't think about a way to change our interaction with the company. Let's see what other people are doing. Let's talk to other people about how they do it, because that's when you really start thinking differently and thinking outside of the box. And then you will see change. The other thing I always say also is that, which means more work. Let me stop there. It's not going to be one size fits all. And so I know that goes against everything I just said with the resourcing challenges I know that we all have, but how can we make things different for different audiences? And so I think that's important. And the last thing I will say is, one of the pivotal moments for me in my compliance career was when I learned that I, as a compliance officer, own too much of the compliance risk. I was owning it. I was advocating for it. And so I flipped it to empower others, whether it was our C-suite, whether it's our managers. We did an ethical leadership guide to really empower the leaders to own some of these risks, because the reality is we're the second line of defense.
That's right.
If the first line is not properly tooled, then we will end up taking on way more than we can bear. And so I think really changing culture and conduct really means empowering that first line of defense to care about the things, to number one, to understand the things that we care about. Number two, to flag those things that we care about so that we can then partner with them to resolve them. That's what we should be doing in our second line, and not really fighting those battles ourselves.
That's great. And it reminds me, what you said there about compliance owning a lot of the risk. Part of that is getting into everyone's mindset, like we all own compliance. And I'm thinking of a really powerful activity that my former boss, Mark Stanley, who was one of our early guests on the show, Mark was leading a session at our Asia Pacific conference several years ago, and he wanted to introduce his team. And so one by one, he'd get us all to stand up. And there were maybe 12 of us at that point in time. And then he asked everyone to stand. And we must have numbered in the thousands, I think, in terms of the numbers of staff. And he just simply said, you are the compliance department. And I felt that was a very powerful visual for everyone to have actively participated and really understood that, you have the ambassadors, the liaisons, the protectors, as Lisa Beth Lentini says, the guardians is what she says. But actually, protectors is not a bad word either, right? The revenue protection department, and yet everyone should have a hand in it. So, if you're looking for something new to do in your conference, I recommend giving that a try. Great points.
It's so important, because what we're subject matter experts in is compliance, ethics, risk, right? How that is manifested in the business. The subject matter experts are the people who are doing it. Barbara Bowler at Compliance Week does this great exercise in one of her classes where she has half the class decorate cupcakes, and the other half of the class write a policy for how to decorate cupcakes. And she will tell you time and time again, the two never talk to each other. That is always going to be a problem, because the procedure and the policy isn't going to reflect what people do, and what people do is not going to reflect the people, the policy. And it's so important that those two come together so that you actually have a good first line of defense.
It's so funny, because when you were talking about your initial discussion about teaching in Dubai and about how students at, the age, in their early 20s, they don't want to know the theory. They want to know more about the how. And I thought, Barbara's cupcake exercise really is a great example of that.
She knows I'm a huge fan of it. I love it. I told her she should copyright it and then sell it as a curriculum, because it's so important that, not only compliance understand what our clients internally do, but that they understand what we do and what we care about. I make this joke all the time. I'm not even sure my husband knows what I do. So if you talk, and we live in the same house, and so if my husband doesn't know what I do, and I talk about it all the time, then how does the other people within your business actually know what you do and care about? And so there is some learning there that can help us all get to the same page that actually has an impact on both culture and conduct.
Yeah. I'm thinking that kind of exercise, that cupcake one, that would probably be worthwhile for companies to try as well from the reverse angle. So how many times do we as compliance think about an initiative, think really hard on pragmatics and logistics for rolling it out, and we don't even talk to the business, right? The ones who are going to be dealing with this. And so I'd be interested to see if we replicated the experiment with compliance officers and having the business decorate the cupcakes. How many compliance people, hopefully it would be more than the students, hopefully that bit of life experience and work experience has pushed them along. But I do think it'd be a really interesting one, and maybe we can think about a way to do an event to see what happens there.
And I'm all about the collaborative compliance approach. So say you do draft a new policy, have a focus group about that policy, send it out, get comments as a business, because it doesn't make sense to roll something out to mandate to require something that, number one, doesn't make business sense, and it doesn't actually speak to the risks that are presented in the business. We had in my class when I was teaching, we talked about sort of the dilemma of Starbucks with their cups and the plastic lining that's in the middle that often prevents a lot of coffee cups from being recycled. And so the problem was presented to the students and say, well, what should they do? And people were like, well, build this big, recycling plant that separates the plastic from the paper. And it was like, and how much would that cost? And where would you put it? And how would you get the cups there? And so, it made sense from a compliance perspective and an environmental impact perspective, but from a business perspective, it wasn't feasible, scalable, or, probably worth the coins that you would spend on it. And so when we have to ebb and flow to find those solutions. And Starbucks instead, has the reusable cup that then gives a discount for that. And so that was their solution. So it was good to discuss, but to have them begin to think through how you have to merge compliance with business in a way that makes sense for both.
Totally. That sounds very reasonable. And I'm glad that you taught on that point, because it's not easy. If it were as easy as us bossing everyone, around and just saying no all the time, you could pay anyone to do that. So it's not that easy.
And no one would want to have lunch with us, Mary. So we want friends too. So.
Exactly. I think that's kudos to everyone who's befriended a compliance officer in the office.
I always say in my training, I know you don't want to see me coming down the hall, but that's why we don't want to be seen as every time we come down the hall, we're just reprimanding or, someone's in trouble. Like when we're partners, and us coming down the hall to visit you shouldn't be such a scary thing, because we have partnered with you proactively, not just reactively.
Yeah, that's one of my big arguments for Compliance Week. Compliance Week has detractors in terms of some people thinking compliance fairs are a bit lame and shouldn't happen. I'm a really big fan of them, and I think one of the easiest reasons for justifying a Compliance Week is that it is one dedicated event where you are not investigating someone and you're not pushing them through a training that they may not want to be in, and maybe that's partly on me if I didn't make it engaging enough. But Compliance Week is a fantastic opportunity for people to put positive correlations between the compliance officer and a totally human experience.
Yep, I agree. And what's interesting as you talk about that, now I'm thinking, like, how does that happen virtually, right? How do you keep that momentum up now that we're in such a virtual world? And, what compliance weeks or integrity weeks look like now that we're here. And that is going to be a big challenge, but doable, right?
Yeah, we're moving ours virtually this year. And an interesting thing is that kind of opens up timing. So based in Boston, which is where our North America headquarters is, we aim for the spring and autumn seasons because it's not so sweaty or snowy, for people to feel comfortable going outside. And now we have a little more scope because it's virtual. So I'm going to look at that silver lining of how a virtual one could, in fact, make life a little easier for those planning them.
Yes. Let me know what you end up doing. It's great. I think the most important thing is that we do it still, right? And we can't underestimate the impact that it still can have.
Absolutely. Well, that's all the time that we have today. Asha, thank you so much for joining us. It was a pleasure to have you on the show.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Great Women in Compliance. We hope you'll join us in honoring the great women in the compliance field by subscribing to this podcast and leaving a review.